Naomi Price was blind. She had been blind since she was 4 years old, when a car accident on Route 9 in Poughkeepsie, New York, took her sight, her mother, and every memory of color she would ever have. But she remembered one thing perfectly: her mother's voice. She heard it every night in her dreams for 30 years. And on September 11th, 2024, standing behind the Family Feud podium with her hand on the buzzer she couldn't see, Naomi heard that voice again. Not in a dream, out loud, through the studio speakers. Her fingers went rigid on the buzzer. Her guide dog, a 4-year-old golden retriever named Sunday, stood up from where he'd been lying at her feet and pressed his body against her leg. Naomi's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her knees bent. Her sister Diane caught her from behind. And Steve Harvey, who had been mid-sentence, reading the next survey question, stopped talking. He set his question card on the podium. He took 3 steps backward. And for the first time in 26 years of television, Steve Harvey did something he had never done. He gave the stage to someone else. It was a Wednesday in Atlanta. The Price family, Naomi, her older sister Diane, her brother Marcus, her Aunt Loretta, and her cousin Terrence, stood behind the left podium. Naomi wore a yellow sundress because Diane had told her yellow was their mother's favorite color. Across from them, the Buchanan family from Tulsa, Oklahoma, 4 brothers and their father, a retired firefighter who cracked jokes during every commercial break and kept the audience laughing. The studio was 72 degrees. 208 people sat in the audience. The lights hummed above the stage, and Naomi couldn't see any of it. But she told a producer backstage that she could feel the heat on her face and hear the way sound bounced differently in a room full of people. She said it felt like standing inside a heartbeat, but nobody in that studio knew what was about to happen. Naomi Price was 4 years old on the morning of November 3, 1994. Her mother, Sandra Price, was driving her to preschool on Route 9. Sandra was 26. She worked as a receptionist at a dentist's office during the day and took nursing classes at Dutchess Community College 3 nights a week. That morning, she was singing. Naomi would later tell interviewers that the only thing she remembered from before the accident, the only image her brain held on to from her sighted life, was her mother's mouth moving in the rearview mirror. Sandra was singing, "His Eye is on the Sparrow." She always sang that hymn on the drive to school. A delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection of Route 9 and Vassar Road. It struck the driver's side at 43 miles per hour. Sandra Price was killed instantly. Naomi was pulled from the back seat with a shattered left orbital bone, a fractured skull, and irreversible damage to both optic nerves. She spent 11 days in the ICU at Vassar Brothers Medical Center. When she woke up, she could not see. She asked for her mother. Her Aunt Loretta, who had driven 3 hours from Philadelphia, held Naomi's hand and said, "Mama's resting, baby." It took 4 more days before anyone told her the truth. Naomi went to live with Loretta in Philadelphia. Loretta was 29, unmarried, working as a bus driver for SEPTA. She had never raised a child. She learned Braille before Naomi did, staying up until 2 a.m. with library books and YouTube tutorials that didn't exist yet, so she printed charts from early internet forums and taped them to her kitchen wall. She learned to describe the world out loud, narrating everything, every color, every texture, every facial expression of every person they passed on the street, so that Naomi could build a world inside her mind. Loretta never complained. She never called it a burden. She called it Tuesday. But there was something Loretta couldn't give her, and that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. When Naomi was 9, she started asking about her mother's voice. Not stories about her mother, not photographs which meant nothing to her. The voice. She told Loretta, I can hear Mama singing in my head, but it's getting quieter. It's getting far away. She was terrified of losing it. She said it was the only part of her mother she had left. By the time she was 14, she told her sister Diane, who was 7 years older and living in New York, that she couldn't hear it anymore. "It's gone," she said. "I lost her voice." Diane said Naomi's face, when she said it, was the most devastated expression she had ever seen on a human being, and she worked as a social worker in the South Bronx. Naomi never told Loretta. She didn't want her aunt to feel like she had failed, so she lied. Every year on November 3rd, the anniversary of the accident, Loretta would sit with Naomi and say, "Tell me about Mama's voice." And Naomi would describe it. Warm, high, a little raspy when she laughed. And Loretta would smile and say, "That's exactly right, baby." But Naomi was reciting a memory of a memory. The actual sound was gone. She was describing something she had written down in Braille in a notebook when she was 10, terrified of the day she'd forget. She had been reading her own notes back to Loretta for 20 years. At 16, Naomi joined her high school choir. She told the director she wanted to learn "His Eye is on the Sparrow." She practiced it every day for a year. She sang it at the school's winter concert, and Loretta sat in the front row and wept through the entire performance. Naomi thought she was crying because the song was beautiful. She wasn't. Loretta was crying because Naomi sang it in the exact same key, with the exact same phrasing, as Sandra. Naomi had no way of knowing that. She had never heard a recording of her mother singing. None existed, or so the family believed. Naomi graduated from Temple University with a degree in social work. She got a job at a nonprofit in Philadelphia that provided services for visually impaired children. She trained guide dogs on weekends. She ran a support group for parents who had lost children and children who had lost parents. She built a life so full of purpose that most people who met her didn't realize she carried a hole in the center of it, shaped exactly like a voice she couldn't remember. What she said next would change everything, but not how anyone expected. In April 2024, Diane submitted the Price family's application to Family Feud. Naomi agreed because she thought it would make Loretta happy. "Auntie Lo deserves something fun," she said. "She's been carrying us for 30 years. What Naomi did not know was that Diane had been searching for something for 6 years. In 2018, Diane had contacted their mother's old dentist office, the church Sandra had attended, Sandra's college, her high school friends, anyone who might have a recording of Sandra's voice, a voicemail, a home video, anything. She found nothing. Every trail ended at a dead phone number or a moved-away contact. Then, in February 2024, a woman named Helen Greer called Diane. Helen was 81 years old. She had been the choir director at Grace Baptist Church in Poughkeepsie in 1994. She told Diane, "I have something you need to hear." Helen had a cassette tape, a recording of the Grace Baptist Choir's Easter service from April 1994, 7 months before the accident. The choir sang 4 hymns that morning. The third hymn was "His Eye is on the Sparrow," and there was a solo. Sandra Price, 26 years old, standing in the front row of a small church in Poughkeepsie, sang the second verse alone. Diane listened to the tape in Helen's living room. She said she sat in a chair and shook for 10 minutes without making a sound. Then she called the Family Feud production office and told them everything. A producer named James Whitfield brought the tape directly to Steve Harvey. Steve listened to it in his dressing room. He played it twice. He set the tape player down and pressed his palms against his eyes. Then he said, "She's going to hear her mother's voice on my stage, and I'm going to get out of the way." Steve would later call what happened next the most important moment of his career. The game was in the third round. The Price family was leading 287 to 195. Naomi had answered 4 questions and gotten every one right. The audience had started cheering her name. During a commercial break, a producer asked Naomi how she knew the answers so quickly. She smiled and said, "I listen. That's all I've ever done." The third round ended. Steve walked to center stage. But instead of reading the next question, he set his cards down. The audience noticed. A murmur moved through the room. Sunday, lying at Naomi's feet, lifted his head. "Naomi," Steve said, "I need to stop the game for a minute." Naomi turned toward his voice. Her head tilted slightly, the way it always did when she was concentrating. "Your sister Diane has been looking for something for 6 years, and 2 months ago, she found it." Naomi's hand found Diane's arm. Her fingers tightened. "Naomi, your mother Sandra sang in a church choir, and in April of 1994, someone recorded her." The studio fell completely silent. "I'm going to play it for you now." Naomi's mouth opened. Her chin dropped toward her chest. Her hand flew up and covered her mouth. She shook her head. She said, "No!" Not in refusal, in disbelief. She said it again. "No! No, that's not real." "It's real," Steve said. "It's her." He nodded to the sound booth. And through the studio speakers, filling every corner of the room, came the voice of Sandra Price. Thin, analog, crackling with 30 years of magnetic tape decay, but unmistakable. A young woman singing, "His eye is on the sparrow," in a small church on an Easter morning in 1994. The voice was high, warm, and slightly raspy at the top of the phrase, exactly the way Naomi had described it in a Braille notebook when she was 10 years old. Naomi's knees hit the floor. Sunday pressed himself against her side. Diane dropped beside her. Loretta grabbed the podium to keep herself upright. Marcus stood behind them with his hands over his face. The studio fell completely silent. 208 people held their breath and listened to a dead woman sing to her daughter. Naomi pressed both palms flat against the stage floor, as if the vibration of the sound might travel through the wood and into her hands. Her shoulders heaved. She said, "That's her. That's my mama. That's her voice." She said it over and over, rocking forward and back, tears running down her face and falling onto the stage floor where her hands were pressed. Steve Harvey stood 10 feet away. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward her. He stepped back. He clasped his hands in front of him and let the tears roll. A cameraman on the right side of the stage was crying so hard his footage was shaking. A makeup artist backstage pressed a towel to her face. The song played for 2 minutes and 14 seconds, and in those 2 minutes and 14 seconds, nobody in the building made a sound except Sandra Price. When the recording ended, Steve waited. He let the silence hold. Then he walked over, knelt beside Naomi, and said, quietly enough that the boom microphone barely caught it, "Let me tell you something." Naomi turned toward his voice. Her face was wet. Her dark glasses sat crooked on her nose. "I know what it's like to lose the thing that keeps you going," Steve said. "Because 28 years ago, I was sitting in a car I was living in, a 1976 Ford Tempo, and I was writing a letter to my family, a goodbye letter. I was done. I was ready to mail it and disappear." He paused. "But I heard a voice, too, not on a tape. An old man at a gas station who said, 'God's got a plan bigger than your pain.' And I held on to that voice. I held on to it for 30 years. He put his hand on Naomi's shoulder. "You held on to your mother's voice for 30 years, and God just gave it back to you." But Steve wasn't done. He stood up and turned to the Buchanan family. The four brothers were standing in a line behind their podium, every one of them crying. Their father, a 63-year-old retired firefighter named Earl, had his hand pressed against his chest. Steve said, "Mr. Buchanan, I need to ask you something." Earl nodded. He couldn't speak. His son Tyler said, "Whatever you need, Steve, whatever she needs." Steve turned to the camera. "Stop everything. I need everyone in this building and everyone watching at home to hear this." A producer's voice came through the overhead speaker, saying they needed to return to the game. Steve held up one finger. "I said stop." He pulled out his phone and dialed. The call connected through the studio speakers. Helen Greer answered on the third ring from her living room in Poughkeepsie. Her voice was thin and steady. "Miss Helen," Steve said, "I'm here with Naomi, Sandra's daughter. She just heard her mother sing." Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sandra would be so proud of her. She talked about that baby every single day." Naomi pressed her hand against her mouth again, and a sound came from behind her fingers that was barely human. But Steve wasn't done. "The Buchanan family has agreed to forfeit their game and give the prize to the Price family," Steve said. Earl Buchanan waved his hand in the air. It wasn't a forfeit, it was a gift, and his face made that clear. "But I've also spoken with my team. The Steve Harvey Foundation is going to establish a recording preservation program in Sandra Price's name, the Sandra Price Voice Archive, to digitize and preserve family recordings for people who have lost loved ones. We're starting with a donation of $250,000. The audience came to their feet. "And Naomi," Steve said. He knelt beside her one more time. "We're giving you every recording from that Easter service, the whole tape, every hymn your mother sang, plus the choir rehearsals Miss Helen found in her attic last week. 4 more tapes. 8 more songs. You're going to hear your mother sing for a very long time." Naomi reached forward and found Steve's hand. She held it with both of hers. She said, "You gave me back my mama." Steve's chin dropped to his chest. He couldn't speak. The audience was standing, crying, applauding. Earl Buchanan walked across the stage and put his arm around Loretta, who was shaking so badly she could barely stand. The Buchanan brothers surrounded Diane and Marcus. 2 families, strangers an hour ago, held each other on a game show stage while a golden retriever named Sunday lay with his chin on Naomi's foot and didn't move. Steve looked directly into the camera. His voice was thick. "Everyone watching at home, if you have a voicemail from someone you lost, don't delete it. If you have a home video with their voice on it, save it, copy it, back it up. Because someday, that recording might be the most important thing in the world to someone who loved them." The clip was posted to YouTube at 9 p.m. that night. By Friday morning, it had 312 million views. The hashtag Mama's Voice trended in 38 countries. Radio stations across the United States played "His Eye is on the Sparrow" in Sandra's honor, and 3 of them aired the original cassette recording with the family's permission. A compilation of viewers reacting to the moment, thousands of people filming themselves hearing Sandra's voice for the first time, reached 410 million views in 11 days. The Sandra Price Voice Archive launched in January 2025, with partnerships from the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, and 14 regional historical societies. In its first year, the archive digitized and preserved over 9,200 family recordings, cassette tapes, answering machine messages, camcorder footage, reel-to-reel recordings, for families who had lost loved ones. Each preserved file was cataloged, backed up in 3 locations, and returned to the family with a handwritten note from Naomi Price. Helen Greer was invited to the foundation's launch event in Washington, D.C. She was 82 by then, walking with a cane, wearing a blue dress she said she had bought for the occasion. She brought the original cassette tape in a padded envelope. She handed it to Naomi on stage, and Naomi held it against her chest like it was made of glass. Steve Harvey said in a later interview, "I've stood on a lot of stages. I've made people laugh. I've made people cry. But I have never felt more useless and more grateful at the same time. That moment wasn't mine. It was Sandra's. All I had to do was step back and let a mother sing to her daughter one more time." In March 2025, 6 months after the episode aired, Naomi sang "His Eye is on the Sparrow" at Grace Baptist Church in Poughkeepsie, the same church where her mother had recorded the solo 31 years earlier. The pews were full. Helen Greer sat in the front row. Diane, Marcus, Loretta, and Terrence sat beside her. The Buchanan family drove from Tulsa to be there. And during the second verse, the verse Sandra had sung alone in 1994, the sound engineer played Sandra's recording through the church speakers, and mother and daughter sang together for the first time in 30 years. Naomi's voice and Sandra's voice, 3 decades apart, filling the same room, hitting the same notes, in the same key. Every person in that church stood. Naomi Price still listens to her mother's voice every morning. She plays the tape at 6:45 a.m. while she makes coffee in her apartment in Philadelphia, Sunday lying across her feet. The sound of Sandra's singing filling the kitchen the same way sunlight fills a room that Naomi has never seen but has always been able to feel. She told a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer, "People ask me what it's like to be blind. I tell them I've only ever been blind to one thing, my mother's face. But I never lost her voice. I just forgot I hadn't." A blind woman stood on a stage she couldn't see, in front of 200 people she would never recognize, and heard a voice that had been silent for 30 years rise from a cassette tape recorded in a church on an Easter morning when the world was still whole. Some things don't need to be seen to be real. They only need to be heard. And some voices don't die. They just wait for the right room. If this story hit you somewhere deep, do one thing. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell. Every week, we bring you moments like Naomi's. Moments the world almost missed. Moments that remind you why people are worth believing in. Subscribe, hit the bell, and send this to someone who needs to hear a voice they've been missing.